The glow from the open hearth furnaces could be seen for miles on a clear night. 16 of them lined the Homestead works, each one a cathedral of fire where temperatures reached nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers in 2 layers of wool clothing moved through the inferno, their faces blackened with soot, their bodies drenched in sweat that evaporated before it could cool them. The roar of the furnaces drowned out all conversation. The heat warped the air itself, making distant objects shimmer like mirages in a desert. Every 6 hours, 40 tons of molten steel poured from each furnace into massive ladles that carried the liquid metal to molds where it would become the raw material of American industry. This was Homestead in 1892. This was the largest steel mill in the world. This was the future being forged in fire, and the men who worked here believed they had built something permanent, something that would outlast them, something that would provide for their children and their children's children. They were wrong about the permanence. They were right about the building. 5:40 in the morning, July 6, 1892. The sky over the Monongahela River hasn't yet begun to lighten, but the men along the riverbank can see the shapes moving on the water. 2 dark barges, pushed by a tugboat called the Little Bill, gliding upstream through the summer fog. Inside those wooden hulls are 300 armed men, Winchester rifles, billy clubs, pistols, hired by the Carnegie Steel Company to break the backs of the workers who built the largest steel mill in the world. The men on the shore have been waiting. They've patrolled these banks for days, watching every approach, every railroad crossing, every road leading into Homestead. When the whistle blows from the mill's pump house, the town awakens. Within the hour, 10,000 people, workers, wives, children, shopkeepers, will line the riverbank to meet those barges. Within 12 hours, men on both sides will be dead. The most powerful company in American industry will wage open warfare against its own employees, not over survival, not over the company's existence, over a 5% wage reduction and the elimination of the union that had dared to negotiate terms. Carnegie Steel had made a record $4.5 million in profit the year before. Andrew Carnegie himself had declared from his castle in Scotland, "Was there ever such a business?" Yet his chairman ordered 300 armed men to float up the river in the dark of night. Were the workers too greedy, or was the company too ruthless? Was this the inevitable collision between capital and labor in the Gilded Age, or something far more deliberate? A calculated massacre designed to crush organized labor for a generation. The Monongahela River cuts through southwestern Pennsylvania like a dark artery, carrying coal, iron ore, and men from the mountains to the mills that would make America an industrial power. In 1880, the town of Homestead was nothing more than a collection of farmland and a few modest buildings along the South Bank, 7 miles upstream from Pittsburgh. The population barely reached 600. Within 3 years, that would change entirely. The Pittsburgh Bessemer Steel Company broke ground in 1881 on a new mill designed by some of the finest industrial engineers of the age. They chose the site for its access to the river, its proximity to the coal fields of Connellsville, and its connection to the expanding railroad networks that could carry finished steel to every corner of a growing nation. The timing was perfect. America was hungry for steel. The railroads were pushing west. Cities were rising. Bridges needed to span rivers that had never been crossed. The Bessemer converters fired up in March of 1881. These massive pear-shaped vessels could transform molten pig iron into steel in a matter of minutes, a process that had previously taken days of skilled labor. Air blasted through the molten metal at tremendous pressure, burning off carbon and impurities in a spectacular display of flame and sparks that lit the night sky for miles. Workers who witnessed it described the roar as deafening, the heat as unbearable, the light as blinding. And yet, it was beautiful. It was power made visible. The mill produced rails at first, the steel that would carry trains across the continent. But from the beginning, there were problems. The Pittsburgh Bessemer Steel Company struggled with finances, with management, with the coordination required to run an operation of such scale. Enter Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had been watching the Homestead works from his offices in Pittsburgh. The Scottish immigrant who had risen from bobbin boy in a cotton mill to telegraph operator to railroad executive to steel magnate understood something fundamental about American industry. Consolidation was destiny. Whoever controlled the raw materials, the transportation, and the manufacturing would control everything. In 1883, Carnegie and his partners purchased the struggling Homestead mill. He saw what others had missed, that this location, this infrastructure, this access to materials and markets could become the crown jewel of an industrial empire. The transformation of Homestead under Carnegie ownership represents one of the most dramatic industrial expansions in American history. Carnegie brought in Julian Kennedy as superintendent, a brilliant engineer who understood that efficiency was measured not just in output, but in integration. Kennedy saw the mill not as a collection of separate operations, but as a single organism that needed to function in perfect coordination. The physical expansion was staggering. In 1885, Kennedy oversaw construction of a new bar and angle mill capable of producing the standardized structural shapes that were revolutionizing construction. The slabbing mill followed, a massive facility that could process steel ingots into the standardized slabs from which plates and sheets would be rolled. What had once required dozens of workers and hours of labor could now be accomplished by machines tended by a handful of men in minutes. But the most significant change came in 1886, when Carnegie installed the first open hearth furnaces at Homestead. Where Bessemer converters produced steel quickly but with limited control over composition, open hearth furnaces allowed operators to precisely adjust the alloy content of the metal. The process took longer, hours instead of minutes, but the steel it produced was suitable for structural beams, for armor plate, for the premium products that commanded premium prices. 16 open hearth furnaces eventually lined the works, each one producing 40 tons of steel every 6 hours, reaching temperatures of nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was enough to warp metal tools at a distance, to cook a man's flesh through 2 layers of wool clothing, to create a permanent summer inside the mill even in the depths of Pennsylvania winter. The open hearth process had been developed independently by William Siemens in England and Pierre-Émile Martin in France in the 1860s. It worked by using regenerative preheating. Waste gases from combustion were captured and used to preheat incoming air and fuel, dramatically increasing the temperature that could be achieved and maintained. The furnaces themselves were massive brick-lined chambers, rectangular in shape, with doors along the sides through which workers could observe the molten metal and add materials to adjust its composition. Skilled operators learned to read the color and behavior of the liquid steel, judging by subtle variations in luminosity when the carbon content was right, when the impurities had been burned away, when the heat was ready to tap. Carnegie's genius extended beyond technology. He understood vertical integration, the control of every step from raw material to finished product. The Homestead works became supplied by tributary coal and iron fields, by the Union Railroad stretching 425 miles, by a fleet of lake steamships carrying ore from the mines of Minnesota. Nothing was purchased that could be produced or transported by Carnegie-owned entities. Every dollar stayed within the empire. The philosophy was simple. Watch the costs and the profits will take care of themselves. By the late 1880s, Carnegie Steel Company was producing more steel than any other entity on Earth. The Homestead Works alone employed nearly 4,000 men, running continuous operations that never stopped, never slowed, never allowed the furnaces to cool. The scale of Carnegie's operation was unprecedented in human history. Before the Industrial Revolution, the largest enterprises had been agricultural estates or trading companies. Even the great railroad corporations of the mid-19th century employed workers spread across thousands of miles, never concentrated in single locations. But Carnegie's steel mills brought thousands of workers together under one roof, or rather, under a series of connected roofs that stretched for miles along the riverbank. The Homestead Works eventually covered over 400 acres, a small city dedicated to a single purpose. The coordination required to run such an operation demanded new forms of management, new systems of accounting, new methods of communication. Carnegie and his partners developed techniques that would become the foundation of modern corporate organization. The money flowed like the molten metal itself. Carnegie's personal fortune grew to levels that made European royalty seem modest by comparison. He built a castle in Scotland called Skibo, a monument to how far a poor immigrant boy could rise in the land of opportunity. He gave interviews about the responsibilities of wealth, about the duty of the rich to uplift society through philanthropy. He wrote essays extolling the virtues of labor unions. The right of the working man to combine and form trades unions is no less sacred than the right of the manufacturer to enter into associations and conferences with his fellows, Carnegie declared in Forum magazine in 1886. He condemned the use of strikebreakers. He proclaimed that no steel mill was worth a single drop of human blood. These words would haunt him. The context in which Carnegie operated was the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe the thin layer of gold that covered the corruption and inequality beneath. Between 1870 and 1900, the American economy grew faster than at any time in history. Railroads connected the continent. Factories produced goods in quantities that would have seemed miraculous a generation earlier. Cities swelled with immigrants seeking opportunity. And a small class of industrialists accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the treasuries of nations. These men, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, were celebrated as captains of industry or condemned as robber barons, depending on one's perspective. They built libraries and hospitals. They also crushed unions and bought politicians. They created modern America. They also created the inequalities that would eventually provoke reform. Carnegie's public philosophy drew heavily from Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism, though with modifications that suited his purposes. He believed that competition inevitably produced winners and losers, that the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the capable was a natural and beneficial process. But he also believed, or claimed to believe, that great wealth carried great responsibilities. In his essay, The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889, Carnegie argued that the rich were merely trustees of their fortunes, obligated to distribute them during their lifetimes for the benefit of society. This philosophy allowed him to accumulate wealth without apparent guilt, while maintaining the image of a benevolent patriarch who understood the struggles of working people because he had once been one of them. Yet even as Carnegie spoke of worker rights, the conditions inside his mills told a different story. 12-hour shifts were standard, 7 days a week, with only the 4th of July recognized as a holiday. A man might work 84 hours in a week and consider himself fortunate to have steady employment. Workers described losing 40 pounds in their first 3 months on the job, as the constant heat and exertion melted flesh from their bodies. "It sweats the life out of a man," one Homestead laborer told a reporter in 1894. "I often drink 2 buckets of water during 12 hours. The sweat drips through my sleeves and runs down my legs and fills my shoes." The physical environment of the mill was almost beyond description. Visitors who toured the Homestead works, and Carnegie encouraged such tours as a form of public relations, wrote of the overwhelming sensory assault. The noise was constant, the roar of furnaces, the crash of machinery, the hiss of steam, the thunder of massive hammers shaping red-hot steel. Communication was impossible except by hand signals and lip reading. Workers developed their own gestural language to coordinate their efforts. The heat varied dramatically from one area to another, frigid near the outside doors in winter, unbearable near the furnaces year-round. Men working the open hearth department wore multiple layers of wool clothing despite the temperature, as the radiant heat would burn exposed skin, even at a distance of 20 feet. The dangers went beyond heat. Workers operated massive machinery that could crush a man in an instant if he lost concentration. They handled molten metal that could burn through flesh to the bone. They breathed air thick with smoke and particulates that would eventually destroy their lungs. The steel industry in Pittsburgh accounted for approximately 20% of all male deaths in the 1880s. A father who left for his shift in the morning might not return in the evening. For this labor, the average worker in 1890 received about $10 a week, just above the poverty line of $500 per year. It took the combined wages of nearly 4,000 steel workers to match the annual earnings of Andrew Carnegie. The workforce at Homestead was a microcosm of the great European migrations that transformed America in the late 19th century. The earliest workers were predominantly skilled craftsmen from Britain, Ireland, and Germany, men who had learned the iron and steel trades in the old country and brought their knowledge across the Atlantic. They commanded premium wages and formed the core of the Amalgamated Association. But as the mills expanded and the demand for labor grew, new waves of immigrants arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe. Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Croats, Italians. They came from villages that had never seen a factory, from agricultural communities where the rhythms of life had remained unchanged for centuries. They took the unskilled jobs that native-born Americans and earlier immigrants refused. Loading ore, hauling materials, cleaning slag, performing the back-breaking labor that kept the furnaces fed. These new immigrants clustered in ethnic neighborhoods that surrounded the mill. The Slavic workers congregated in areas that came to be known as Hunkytown or Slavic Hill. The Italians had their own district. Each group maintained its own churches, its own social clubs, its own newspapers in the mother tongue. The skilled workers, who were mostly native-born or from earlier immigrant waves, looked down on the newcomers as ignorant, unclean, willing to work for wages that undercut established standards. The ethnic divisions weakened labor solidarity and made it easier for management to play one group against another. The union, reflecting the prejudices of its membership, initially refused to organize the unskilled workers, a decision that would have profound consequences. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had organized the Pittsburgh Bessemer Steel Works before Carnegie ever acquired it, establishing lodges at Homestead shortly after production began in 1881. The union represented skilled workers, the men who possessed specialized knowledge that kept the furnaces running, who understood the chemistry of steelmaking, who could read the color of molten metal and know precisely when to tap the heat. The first major confrontation came on January 1, 1882, when workers struck to prevent management from requiring them to sign contracts prohibiting union membership, the so-called yellow dog contracts that would become weapons against labor for decades. The strike lasted nearly 3 months and ended in complete victory for the union. The Amalgamated was one of the most powerful labor organizations in America during the 1880s. At its peak, it claimed over 24,000 members in lodges scattered across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and other steel-producing states. The union operated on craft principles, organizing workers by skill rather than by industry. Puddlers, rollers, heaters, roughers, each specialty had its own lodge with its own traditions and its own jealously guarded prerogatives. This structure gave skilled workers considerable bargaining power, as their specialized knowledge was difficult to replace. But it also meant that the mass of unskilled laborers remained outside the union's protection, available to be used as strikebreakers or replacement workers when disputes arose. A second strike erupted in July of 1889, when negotiations for a new collective bargaining agreement collapsed. The strikers seized control of the town itself, making common cause with immigrant workers from Eastern Europe who had not previously been part of the union. When a trainload of strikebreakers arrived on July 10th, 2,000 townspeople drove them off. Carnegie officials later conceded that after this victory, the Amalgamated essentially ran the Homestead plant. The union contract contained 58 pages of footnotes defining work rules and strictly limiting management's ability to maximize output. The skilled workers determined the pace of production. They had, in effect, become partners in the enterprise. The 1889 strike revealed both the strengths and the limitations of the labor movement. The skilled workers had demonstrated that solidarity with immigrant laborers could multiply their power. The community had shown that it would stand with the workers against outside interference. But the victory also created a target. Carnegie and his partners understood that the union's control of the plant was incompatible with their vision of absolute management authority. The 58 pages of work rules represented 58 pages of constraints on efficiency, on flexibility, on the ability to introduce new machinery or new methods without negotiation. From the owner's perspective, the workers had become obstacles rather than assets. Carnegie agreed with his partners that the union must be broken. "We must reorganize the whole affair," he wrote, "and exact good reasons for employing every man. Far too many men required by amalgamated rules." The philosophy that praised labor unions in public essays demanded their elimination in private correspondence. But Carnegie also understood that breaking the union would require methods he could not publicly endorse. He needed a man willing to do the work that would destroy his carefully cultivated image as a friend of labor. He needed Henry Clay Frick. Frick was 41 years old in 1891 when Carnegie placed him in charge of operations at Homestead. The son of a failed farmer from Westmoreland County, Frick had built his fortune in the coke fields of Connellsville, turning coal into the fuel that powered steelmaking. By the age of 30, he was a millionaire. By 40, he controlled 80% of the coke output in Pennsylvania through his H.C. Frick and Company. His methods were not subtle. When workers at the coke ovens attempted to organize, Frick evicted their families from company housing. When they struck for higher wages, he imported immigrants willing to work for less and housed them behind armed guards. He destroyed unions the way Carnegie destroyed competitors, systematically, ruthlessly, completely. Frick's rise to power illustrated the brutal logic of Gilded Age capitalism. He had grown up in modest circumstances, the grandson of a prosperous distiller whose fortune had been squandered by Frick's father. Young Henry had watched his family's decline and determined that he would never be dependent on anyone else's success or failure. He educated himself in business, worked as a clerk in his grandfather's distillery, and saved every penny until he could begin investing in coke production. The coke ovens of Connellsville were dangerous, dirty, and enormously profitable. Frick understood that whoever controlled the coke supply controlled the steel industry, and he set about acquiring ovens with single-minded determination. The coke business taught Frick everything he needed to know about labor relations. The beehive ovens that converted coal to coke required constant tending by workers who labored in conditions even worse than those in steel mills. The ovens operated around the clock, and the men who tended them worked in temperatures that exceeded anything in the steel-making process. When workers organized and struck for better conditions, Frick responded with a combination of imported labor, armed guards, and legal prosecution that broke their resistance within weeks. He had no patience for negotiation, no sympathy for worker grievances, no hesitation about using force. These qualities made him invaluable to Carnegie. The partnership between Carnegie and Frick was one of the most consequential business relationships in American history. They complemented each other perfectly. Carnegie was the visionary, the public face, the man who charmed investors and politicians and journalists. Frick was the operator, the enforcer, the man who made unpleasant decisions and carried them out without flinching. Carnegie provided Frick with access to capital and respectability. Frick provided Carnegie with the ruthlessness that genteel pretensions would not allow. Together, they built an empire that dominated American industry for a generation. When negotiations with the Amalgamated began in early 1892, as the existing contract approached expiration, Frick made demands he knew the union would reject. The workers asked for wage increases to reflect Carnegie Steel's record profits. Frick countered with a 22% wage reduction affecting nearly half the union's membership. When the union refused these terms, Frick announced he would continue negotiating for 29 more days. If no contract was reached by June 24th, Carnegie Steel would no longer recognize the Amalgamated Association. The company would deal with workers only as individuals, never again as members of a collective bargaining unit. The wage reduction was calculated to provoke rejection. Frick understood that the skilled workers would never accept such terms voluntarily. Their pride and their economic interests both demanded resistance. By making an offer that was certain to be refused, he created the pretext for the confrontation he wanted. The union would appear to be the aggressor, striking against a reasonable employer who had tried to negotiate in good faith. The reality, of course, was precisely the opposite. Frick had no intention of reaching an agreement. He wanted a fight, and he prepared for one with military precision. Carnegie approved these tactics on May 4th. "We all approve of anything you do," he wrote to Frick, not stopping short of approval of a contest. "We are with you to the end." Then he sailed for Scotland, leaving Frick in absolute command. The vacation was strategic. Whatever happened next, Carnegie wanted an ocean between himself and the consequences. He could plausibly claim ignorance of the details while reaping the benefits of the outcome. Throughout the summer of 1892, Carnegie sent encouraging cables from Skibo Castle, while Frick did the dirty work in Pittsburgh. Frick wasted no time. In early June, he ordered construction of a solid board fence topped with barbed wire around the entire Homestead works. The fence stood 12 feet high, 3 miles long, with regularly spaced rifle ports at shoulder height. Workers dubbed it Fort Frick. Searchlights were installed. Guard towers rose above the fence line. Frick was preparing for war. On June 28th, he locked workers out of the plate mill and one of the open hearth furnaces. When no agreement was reached by June 29th, the lockout expanded to include the entire plant. On July 2nd, Frick formally fired all 3,800 workers. Those who wished to return would have to apply as new employees, signing individual contracts that prohibited union membership and accepted whatever wages management chose to pay. The fence around the Homestead works sent an unmistakable message. This was not a negotiating tactic, it was a declaration of war. The rifle ports and guard towers made clear that Frick expected violence and was prepared to meet it with force. The workers who had spent years building the mill, who knew every furnace and rolling machine and rail line, were now officially excluded from property they had helped create. The transformation from employees to trespassers was complete. Whatever happened next would be their fault for refusing to accept the terms they had been offered. The price of steel had fallen from $35 per ton in 1890 to $22 by early 1892. This fact provided the public justification for wage cuts. What Frick did not mention was that technological improvements at Homestead had dramatically increased productivity over the same period. Each worker was producing far more steel than before, meaning that even at lower prices per ton, the company's profits had actually increased. Carnegie Steel had cleared $4.5 million in 1891, more than any previous year in the company's history. The wage cuts were not about survival. They were about maximizing shareholder returns and eliminating the union that might demand a share of future gains. The economics of the dispute were complex, but ultimately favored the workers' interpretation. Wages at Homestead were tied to the selling price of steel through a sliding scale that had been negotiated in previous contracts. As prices rose, wages rose. As prices fell, wages fell. This arrangement had provided a measure of protection for workers during boom times, while giving management flexibility during downturns. Frick's proposal would have lowered the minimum price at which the sliding scale began, effectively reducing wages even if steel prices remained stable. The workers understood that accepting such terms would leave them permanently worse off, regardless of how the market performed. But the workers refused to disperse. The Amalgamated Association established an advisory committee to coordinate the response. They patrolled the roads leading into Homestead, blocking every approach to the plant. They rented a steamboat to watch the river. They organized the town on a military basis, with pickets working 8-hour shifts, signal systems communicating any movement of company forces, and strict discipline maintained among the strikers. Saloons were closed to prevent drunkenness. The committee assumed virtual control of Homestead, managing utilities, maintaining order, proclaiming ad hoc laws. When the county sheriff attempted to move against the strikers with a small force of deputies, the workers offered him a tour of the plant and promised to guarantee security of the property themselves. They would protect the mill from any trespassers. They would not, however, allow strikebreakers to take their jobs. The organization of the strike demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of the labor movement. The workers had established an alternative government in Homestead, one that commanded more loyalty than the official authorities. They had shown that working people could coordinate complex operations, maintain discipline, and present a united front against corporate power. But they had also revealed their hand. Frick now knew exactly what he was facing. A well-organized force that could not be intimidated by ordinary means. He would need to bring overwhelming force to bear, and he would need to do it in a way that bypassed the workers' carefully constructed defenses. Sheriff William McCleary reported back to Pittsburgh that he could not muster a posse large enough to challenge the workers' control of the town. Local sympathy ran entirely with the strikers. The merchants of Homestead depended on steelworker wages for their livelihoods. The landlords who rented housing to mill families had no interest in seeing those families impoverished. Even the local political establishment, nominally aligned with business interests, understood that a company victory would devastate the community. The calculus was simple. The workers' prosperity was the town's prosperity, and whatever hurt the workers would hurt everyone. Frick had anticipated this. As early as April, he had contracted with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to provide 300 armed agents who could be deployed to Homestead when the time came. The Pinkertons were notorious. Founded by Allan Pinkerton before the Civil War, the agency had evolved from providing security services into something closer to a private army available for hire by industrialists facing labor unrest. Between 1866 and 1892, Pinkerton agents had participated in 70 labor disputes, facing down over 125,000 strikers. Homestead Mayor John McLuckie called them a horde of cutthroats, thieves, and murderers in the employ of unscrupulous capital for the oppression of honest labor. Allan Pinkerton himself had died in 1884, but his sons Robert and William continued the family business with undiminished enthusiasm for strikebreaking. The agency maintained offices in major cities across the country and could assemble forces of several hundred men on short notice. Many of its regular agents were former police officers or soldiers who had experience with violence. But the agency also recruited temporary workers for large operations, hiring men from employment agencies and boarding houses with promises of easy money and no questions asked. These temporary recruits were often desperate, unskilled, and entirely unprepared for the situations into which they would be thrust. The plan was conceived by Philander Knox, Carnegie Steele's attorney, who would later serve as Attorney General of the United States under Presidents McKinley and Roosevelt. Knox understood that approaching Homestead by land would be impossible. The workers had every road covered, and local law enforcement would not assist. A frontal assault would result in a pitched battle that the company might lose, but the river offered an alternative route. The Pinkertons could board barges downstream, be towed upstream through the night, and land directly at the company's dock inside the mill property. By the time the workers realized what was happening, the private army would be in position to secure the plant. At 10:30 on the night of July 5th, 300 Pinkerton agents assembled at the embarkation point near Davis Island Dam on the Ohio River, about 5 miles below Pittsburgh. They were issued Winchester rifles, billy clubs, and badges reading Watchman Carnegie Company Limited. Many were not regular Pinkerton detectives, but recruits hired from lodging houses in New York and Chicago at $2.50 per day. They had been told they were going to guard a property somewhere in Pennsylvania. They had not been told they would be facing thousands of armed and determined workers. The barges were covered in wood and iron to provide protection from gunfire. Mattresses lined the interior walls. The Pinkertons were loaded like cargo, then set adrift on the dark river. The two barges, named the Iron Mountain and the Monongahela, were pushed upstream by a tugboat called the Little Bill, captained by a man named Rogers, who had no idea what cargo he was carrying until it was too late to turn back. The journey upstream took several hours, with the barges moving slowly against the current through the summer darkness. Inside, the men sat or lay on the deck, some sleeping, others too nervous to rest. The regular Pinkerton agents tried to maintain discipline, but the temporary recruits were already having second thoughts. None of them had signed up for what was coming. The Amalgamated had intelligence operations of its own. Union members had tracked the Pinkertons from the moment they left Boston. When the barges departed from Davis Island, runners carried the news to Homestead within hours. By 3 in the morning, the pump house whistle was sounding the alarm. By 4, thousands of people were streaming toward the riverbank. Women grabbed their children, men grabbed their rifles. The streets of Homestead filled with running figures, all converging on the spot where the barges would attempt to land. The response was spontaneous but coordinated. Years of union organization had created networks of communication that could mobilize the entire community in minutes. The whistle signals were understood by everyone. One pattern meant fire, another meant accident, another meant strikebreakers approaching. When the alarm sounded on July 6th, there was no confusion about what it meant. Families who had been asleep at 4 in the morning were dressed and moving toward the river within minutes. By the time the first light of dawn appeared over the hills to the east, thousands of people lined the riverbank, waiting for the barges that would carry armed men in the service of corporate power. When dawn broke over the Monongahela on July 6th, the scene that awaited the Pinkertons was not the undefended mill property they had been promised, but a small army stretched along the shore. Workers had torn down a section of the company fence to gain access to the landing area. Men crouched behind piles of pig iron and scrap steel, rifles ready. Women stood in the open, daring the Pinkertons to fire on them. The crowd continued to grow as more townspeople arrived, drawn by the whistle and the word spreading through the streets. The barges grounded against the bank at approximately 4:30 in the morning. As the gangplanks lowered, a voice from the crowd shouted a challenge. Testimony would later conflict about what happened next. Some witnesses said the Pinkertons opened fire first. Others insisted the workers shot first. What is certain is that within seconds, both sides were exchanging gunfire at close range. The first casualties fell on both sides almost simultaneously. William Foy, a worker, and Frederick Hinde, captain of the Pinkerton force. The morning erupted into chaos. The initial exchange lasted approximately 10 minutes before both sides took cover. The Pinkertons retreated into the barges, cutting holes in the wooden sides to create firing positions. The workers scrambled behind piles of pig iron and scrap steel in the mill yard, shooting at the vessels from elevated positions along the riverbank. Hundreds of women crowded between the two forces, screaming for the workers to kill the Pinkertons, hurling rocks and debris at the barges. The tugboat Little Bill attempted to pull away but was driven back by gunfire. Captain Rogers, wounded in the initial exchange, managed to retreat downstream with some of the injured, but he refused to abandon the barges entirely. The vessels remained stranded at the landing, trapped between the hostile shore and the river. As the morning progressed, the situation for the Pinkertons became desperate. Workers constructed a rampart of steel beams along the riverbank, providing elevated firing positions from which they could shoot down onto the trapped vessels. The sun rose higher, and temperatures inside the wooden barges climbed with it. Men who had expected an easy assignment found themselves pinned down under withering fire with no means of escape. The regular Pinkerton agents tried to maintain order, but panic was spreading among the temporary recruits. Many of them threw down their weapons and refused to participate further. A second attempt to disembark at 8 in the morning was met with concentrated gunfire that killed 4 more workers. Shrapnel from a small cannon, borrowed from a Grand Army of the Republic post in nearby Wilkinsburg, wounded several Pinkertons. By noon, a sniper had picked off another Pinkerton agent attempting to find water. The sun beat down on the barges, turning them into ovens. Men inside were suffering from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and terror. The sounds of gunfire, screaming, and the impact of bullets on wood created a continuous assault on the senses. The workers tried everything to dislodge the barges. They poured oil on the river and set it ablaze, but the flames failed to reach the vessels. They attempted to launch a burning railroad car down a track toward the landing, but it derailed before reaching its target. They fired a cannon repeatedly at the barges, though with limited accuracy. Someone suggested building a raft loaded with dynamite and floating it downstream to the stranded vessels. Throughout the long afternoon, occasional gunfire crackled from both sides. The Pinkertons were running low on ammunition. Many of the recruits who had never signed up for combat were near mutiny. Inside the barges, the scene was one of chaos and despair. Dead men lay where they had fallen, their bodies impossible to move in the confined space. Wounded men groaned and cried for water. The temperature continued to rise as the July sun beat down on the wooden hulls. Some of the Pinkerton agents later described hallucinations brought on by heat and dehydration. Others described the sounds, the constant gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the thuds of bullets striking wood, as a form of torture that continued for hours without relief. By 5 in the afternoon, the Pinkertons had had enough. They raised a white flag and requested terms of surrender. The advisory committee debated what to do with their prisoners. Some argued for immediate arrest and prosecution for murder. Others wanted more direct justice. Hugh O'Donnell, the committee chairman, argued for restraint. He understood that how the workers treated the surrendering Pinkertons would shape public perception of the entire dispute. Eventually, the committee agreed to allow the Pinkertons to leave on trains, provided they surrendered their weapons and submitted to passage through a gauntlet of townspeople. As the Pinkertons emerged from the barges and walked up the riverbank, the crowd surged forward. What followed was a beating that lasted the length of the journey from the river to the temporary jail. Men, women, and children struck the Pinkertons with clubs, umbrellas, rocks, bare fists. They kicked the fallen agents and stomped on those who stumbled. They tore at clothing and scratched at faces. The accumulated rage of the day, the deaths, the wounds, the terror of the battle, found expression in violence against the men who had come to take their jobs. By the time the surviving Pinkertons reached the railroad depot, nearly half of them had sustained injuries. It was remarkably a measure of restraint that none were killed during the surrender. The beaten Pinkertons were eventually transported to Pittsburgh, where they were released without charges. Many of them never worked for the agency again. Some gave interviews describing their experience, portraying themselves as innocent victims who had been deceived about the nature of the job. Others disappeared into the anonymity of the city's boarding houses, trying to forget what they had seen and done. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency issued statements defending its actions, but the debacle at Homestead damaged its reputation and led to congressional hearings that eventually restricted the use of private security forces in labor disputes. The congressional investigation into the Pinkerton Agency revealed the extent to which private military force had become normalized in American industrial relations. Witnesses testified about the agency's methods, the infiltration of unions, the use of agents provocateurs to justify violent crackdowns, the systematic gathering of intelligence on labor organizers. The hearings resulted in several states passing anti-Pinkerton laws that restricted the importation of armed guards across state lines. But these reforms came too late to help the workers of Homestead, and the broader pattern of using private security forces against labor would continue for decades. When the final accounting was made, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons lay dead. Dozens more on both sides were wounded. The barges were set ablaze and burned spectacularly through the night, their flames reflecting off the river. The workers had won. They controlled the plant, the town, and the approaches. Hugh O'Donnell declared victory. Surely now the company would negotiate, but O'Donnell had miscalculated. The violence at Homestead transformed a local labor dispute into a national crisis. Newspapers across the country reported the battle with horror. Opinion divided sharply along class lines. Labor sympathizers praised the workers for defending their livelihoods against corporate aggression. Business interests condemned the strikers as anarchists and rioters who had defied legitimate property rights. Governor Robert Pattison of Pennsylvania, a Democrat who had hoped to avoid intervention, found himself under enormous pressure to restore order. Frick immediately requested state militia support. The press coverage of Homestead revealed the deep divisions in American society. Newspapers aligned with labor interests, and there were many in the 1890s, portrayed the workers as heroes defending their homes against a corporate invasion. The New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's flagship, ran sympathetic stories about the families affected by the lockout, but newspapers aligned with business interests portrayed the workers as dangerous radicals who had defied lawful authority and engaged in murder. The Pittsburgh Commercial Gazette, closely tied to the steel industry, demanded immediate military intervention to restore order. The battle for public opinion would prove as important as the battle on the riverbank. On July 10th, Pattison ordered 8,000 members of the Pennsylvania National Guard to Homestead under the command of Major General George Snowden. The troops arrived on July 12th, marching into the town with fixed bayonets and artillery. The advisory committee greeted them with music and cheers, hoping the militia would serve as neutral peacekeepers. They were wrong. Snowden declared martial law and announced that he would take absolute control of both the mill and the town. The gates of the Homestead works swung open, and for the first time since June, company officials walked freely onto the property. The National Guard's intervention was ostensibly neutral. The troops were there to maintain order, not to take sides in a labor dispute. But the effect was entirely one-sided. The workers had been preventing strikebreakers from entering the plant. Now the Guard prevented workers from interfering with the importation of replacement labor. The workers had been controlling access to company property. Now the Guard controlled everything. Martial law meant that the advisory committee's authority was superseded, that the workers' pickets were dissolved, that the elaborate system of patrols and signals that had kept the company at bay was dismantled overnight. With the National Guard protecting the approaches, Frick began importing strikebreakers. Advertisements had already been placed in newspapers across the country, promising good wages to any man willing to work at Homestead. Skilled workers were recruited from other mills with guarantees of permanent employment. Unskilled laborers arrived by the trainload, immigrants from Eastern Europe, African Americans from the South, anyone desperate enough to cross a picket line under military protection. The union barred African Americans from membership, a racist policy that the company exploited ruthlessly. Many of the black workers who took jobs at Homestead had few alternatives in an America that offered them little except the opportunity to be exploited by one side or the other. The use of African American strikebreakers was a deliberate provocation. Frick understood that the white workers' racism would make it harder for them to build solidarity with the replacement labor. He also understood that black workers, excluded from union membership and denied most other economic opportunities, would be willing to cross picket lines that white workers might respect. The strategy worked exactly as planned. The strikers' anger at the replacement workers took on a racial dimension that further divided the working class and weakened the labor movement's moral authority. Production resumed at reduced capacity by mid-July. The strikers could only watch as others did their work. The advisory committee maintained discipline and organized relief efforts for families without income, but the momentum had shifted. Each day that the mill operated with scab labor was a day that proved the workers could be replaced. The skilled knowledge that had been the union's greatest asset was being transferred to new workers, recorded in manuals, embedded in machinery that required less human judgment. Then came the event that destroyed whatever public sympathy remained. On July 23rd, a young Russian anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into Frick's Pittsburgh office with a revolver and a sharpened steel file. He was not connected to the Amalgamated Association or to organized labor in any way. He was associated with Emma Goldman and the radical anarchist movement that believed direct action against capitalists would inspire workers to revolution. He shot Frick twice and stabbed him repeatedly before being subdued. Frick, bleeding from multiple wounds, insisted on completing his business correspondence before allowing himself to be treated. He survived, and the assassination attempt transformed him from villain to victim in the public imagination. Berkman was 21 years old, a recent immigrant from Lithuania who had been radicalized by the poverty and injustice he witnessed in America. He and Goldman, his lover and intellectual mentor, believed that a spectacular act of violence against a prominent capitalist would awaken the working class to its own power. They were wrong. The attack on Frick accomplished nothing except to discredit the labor movement and provide ammunition for those who portrayed all workers' organizations as fronts for foreign anarchism. Goldman herself was investigated by authorities and would later be deported during the Red Scare of 1919. The newspapers that had criticized Frick's tactics now praised his courage. The image of the wounded industrialist refusing to leave his desk until his correspondence was completed became a symbol of American determination and resolve. The workers who had fought against Pinkerton aggression were now associated with anarchist violence. It didn't matter that Berkman had no connection to Homestead or to the union. Guilt by association was enough. Sympathy strikes that had begun at other Carnegie operations were abandoned. The American Federation of Labor refused to intervene further. The Amalgamated Association was alone. Criminal charges piled up against the strike leaders. 167 men were indicted for crimes ranging from murder to conspiracy to treason against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The treason charges were based on the theory that resisting the National Guard was equivalent to making war against the state, a legal doctrine that had not been invoked since the Whiskey Rebellion a century earlier. Hugh O'Donnell and other advisory committee members spent weeks in jail, unable to make the $100,000 bail. They were eventually acquitted of all charges by sympathetic juries, but the prosecutions achieved their purpose. The union leadership was neutralized at the critical moment. The legal aftermath of Homestead revealed the extraordinary power that the state could bring to bear against organized labor. Workers who had defended their community against a private invasion were now being prosecuted as traitors. The charge was absurd on its face. Treason requires levying war against the government, and the workers had done nothing of the kind, but it served to intimidate and distract the union leadership during the critical weeks when the strike's outcome hung in the balance. Even after the acquittals, the message was clear. Challenging corporate power meant risking not just your job, but your freedom. By October, the strike was collapsing. Workers who had held out for months began drifting back to the plant, signing individual contracts that renounced union membership. The mechanics and day laborers who had supported the skilled workers asked to be released from their pledge of solidarity. On November 17th, the advisory committee voted 101 to 91 to end the strike and accept the company's terms. The workers returned to jobs that paid less than before, worked longer hours, and offered no protection against future cuts. The union that had essentially run the Homestead Works for 3 years was destroyed. Frick announced the victory with characteristic bluntness. Under no circumstances will we have any further dealing with the Amalgamated Association as an organization. This is final. And it was. The Yellow Dog contracts were now mandatory. Any man who joined a union or spoke favorably of organized labor would be immediately terminated and blacklisted. The 12-hour shifts that the union had reduced to 8 were reinstated. Wages fell by 1/5 between 1892 and 1907, while productivity increased dramatically. The skilled workers who had commanded premium salaries found themselves replaced by machines and immigrants who could be trained in days rather than years. The aftermath extended far beyond Homestead. Membership in the Amalgamated Association plummeted from 24,000 in 1892 to under 8,000 by 1895. For 26 years, until the final months of World War I, union organizing among steelworkers was effectively crushed. The methods that Frick employed became standard practice across American industry. The combination of private security forces, strikebreakers, and state military power proved devastatingly effective. Other industrialists took note. When labor disputes arose at their facilities, they followed the Homestead playbook. Build fences, hire Pinkertons, call in the militia, prosecute the leaders. The legal framework that governed labor relations in 1892 offered workers virtually no protection. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which might have been used to limit corporate power, was instead wielded against labor unions as combinations in restraint of trade. The courts routinely sided with employers, issuing injunctions against strikes and ruling that union organizers were engaged in conspiracy. Law enforcement at every level could be deployed to protect corporate property, but not worker rights. Workers could vote, could petition, could organize, could strike. But when they challenged the fundamental prerogatives of ownership, they would be crushed. The disparity between the treatment of capital and labor was stark. When Carnegie and his competitors met to fix prices or divide markets, the courts rarely intervened. When workers met to set wage demands or coordinate strikes, they faced prosecution for conspiracy. The legal system operated on the assumption that property rights were absolute and that any interference with an employer's control of his workforce was illegitimate. This framework would persist largely unchanged until the 1930s, when the devastation of the Great Depression finally created the political will for reform. Carnegie Steel's profits rose to a staggering $106 million in the 9 years following Homestead. The company expanded rapidly, absorbing competitors and integrating ever more stages of production under single ownership. From the perspective of the shareholders, Homestead was not a tragedy, but a triumph. The elimination of the union allowed management to implement changes that would have been impossible under the old contract. New machinery, new work schedules, new methods of production that increased output while reducing the workforce. Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, a sum so vast that Morgan reportedly congratulated Carnegie on becoming the richest man in the world. The holdings were incorporated into the United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in American history. U.S. Steel controlled nearly 45% of American steel production and operated the Homestead Works for another 85 years. The mill expanded with $7 million in improvements announced in 1906. The workforce peaked at 15,000 during World War II, when the furnaces ran day and night to produce armor plate for battleships and tanks. The creation of U.S. Steel marked a new phase in American capitalism. The age of individual industrialists like Carnegie was giving way to the age of professional management and institutional investment. Morgan's combination brought stability to an industry that had been characterized by cutthroat competition and boom-bust cycles. But it also created a bureaucratic giant that would eventually become complacent, resistant to innovation, and vulnerable to foreign competition. The irony was bitter. The workers had lost the battle in 1892, but the Union eventually returned. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal protections under the National Labor Relations Act enabled the Steelworkers Organizing Committee to gain footholds in the 1930s, culminating in industry-wide recognition by 1942. The United Steelworkers of America negotiated contracts that restored some of what had been lost: 8-hour shifts, better wages, safety regulations, pension plans. For a generation after World War II, the steelworkers of Homestead enjoyed middle-class prosperity. They bought houses, sent children to college, took vacations to places their grandparents could never have afforded. The return of unions to the steel industry was not automatic or inevitable. It required the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, which discredited the laissez-faire capitalism of the Gilded Age. It required political leadership willing to challenge corporate power. And it required workers willing to take risks, to strike, to organize, to face the same threats of violence and prosecution that had destroyed the Amalgamated in 1892. The sit-down strikes of the 1930s, which saw workers occupy factories rather than simply walking out, proved impossible for management to break with the old methods. You could replace workers who struck. You could not easily remove workers who sat down inside the plant and refused to leave. But the victory was temporary. The same forces that had threatened Homestead in the 1890s, competition, technology, the relentless drive for efficiency, returned with greater force in the 1970s and 80s. Foreign steelmakers, particularly in Japan, had rebuilt their industries after World War II with the latest equipment and techniques. American companies, including U.S. Steel, had failed to modernize. The open hearth furnaces that had been revolutionary in 1886 were obsolete by 1970. The basic oxygen process that could produce steel in 40 minutes instead of 8 hours had been adopted by foreign competitors, while American mills clung to outdated methods. The failure to modernize was not simply a matter of complacency. American steel companies had become bureaucratic giants, slow to change, resistant to innovation. They had also faced labor costs that exceeded those of their foreign competitors, a consequence of the very union victories that had followed the 1930s. The workers had finally won the benefits and wages that Frick and Carnegie had denied them, only to find those wages priced them out of competition with workers in Japan and Korea who would accept far less. Management pointed to union work rules as the source of inefficiency. Unions pointed to management's failure to invest in new technology. Both had a point. The collapse came swiftly. Between 1979 and 1986, the American steel industry shed hundreds of thousands of jobs. The carry blast furnaces, which had fed molten iron to Homestead for 70 years, shut down in 1978. The final steel production at Homestead ceased in 1983. The mill that had employed 15,000 workers, that had produced the steel for the Brooklyn Bridge and the Empire State Building and the guns that won 2 world wars, fell silent. The human cost of deindustrialization was devastating. Men who had worked in the mills for decades found themselves unemployed with skills that had no market value. The specialized knowledge that had once commanded premium wages, how to read the color of molten steel, when to tap the heat, how to operate the massive rolling machines, was suddenly worthless. Workers in their 50s who had expected to retire from the mill found themselves competing for minimum wage jobs with teenagers. Some retrained, many did not. Alcoholism, depression, and family breakdown followed the mill closures like shadows. The closure took with it 7,000 jobs and the economic foundation of a community that had existed for a century. In 1940, 19,041 people lived in Homestead. By 1980, the population had dropped to barely 4,000. By 2010, just over 3,000 remained. Today, roughly 29% of Homestead residents live below the poverty line. The median household income is $38,000, less than half the national average. The physical plant that had defined Homestead was demolished in the early 1990s. Park Corporation purchased the property in 1988 with plans for redevelopment that never materialized. The buildings were gutted and sold for scrap. In 1999, the Waterfront Shopping Center opened on the former mill site, an outdoor mall with chain restaurants, big box retailers, and movie theaters. Where workers had once forged steel, consumers now shop for athletic shoes and electronics. Not everything was erased. 12 smokestacks still stand in the middle of the waterfront development, preserved as monuments to a past that shoppers walk by without understanding. The Bost Building, which served as headquarters for the striking workers in 1892, has been restored as a museum. The pump house where the alarm whistle sounded on July 6th survives near the river. And across the Monongahela, the carry blast furnaces remain, two massive structures 92 feet tall, standing silent above the water that once carried barges loaded with armed men. The Carey furnaces were designated a National Historic Landmark in 2006. The Rivers of Steel Heritage Corporation offers tours from May through October, guiding visitors through the rusting infrastructure of an industry that no longer exists. A metal sculpture called the Carey Deer, created by guerrilla artists who trespassed on the abandoned property in the late 1990s, has become an icon of Pittsburgh's post-industrial identity. When the sculpture deteriorated, community members organized a Kickstarter campaign to fund repairs. The furnaces that once produced over 1,000 tons of iron per day now host weddings and photography workshops. The preservation of industrial sites like the Carey furnaces reflects a broader reckoning with the meaning of America's industrial past. For decades after the mills closed, there was little appetite for remembering what had been lost. The ruins were embarrassments, reminders of decline and failure. But a new generation, one that never knew the mills when they operated, has begun to see them differently. The massive scale of the structures, the ingenuity they represent, the labor they demanded, all of this has become worthy of commemoration. Industrial tourism has emerged as a small but significant part of Pittsburgh's economy, drawing visitors who want to understand how the physical infrastructure of modern America was created. Andrew Carnegie spent the remaining years of his life giving away his fortune. He endowed more than 2,500 libraries across America and around the world, including the Carnegie Library of Homestead, which opened in 1898 and still serves the community today. He funded universities, concert halls, research institutions, and peace organizations. He proclaimed that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He gave away roughly $350 million in his lifetime. And yet, he could never escape what happened at Homestead. When pressed about the strike in later years, he claimed ignorance of Frick's tactics. He blamed his subordinate for decisions that Carnegie himself had approved. The letters he wrote to Frick in 1892, approving anything you do, not stopping short of approval of a contest, were suppressed during his lifetime. The Carnegie Libraries stand as complicated monuments. They offered education and opportunity to millions of Americans who might otherwise have had neither. Children of workers grew up reading books in buildings paid for by the man who had crushed their fathers' unions. Communities that Carnegie's business practices had impoverished were enriched by his philanthropic guilt. The libraries were magnificent. They were also a kind of elaborate apology for sins that were never explicitly acknowledged. Frick and Carnegie eventually became enemies. Their falling out came not over Homestead, but over business disputes in the late 1890s. Frick attempted to sell his stake in the company to outside investors. Carnegie blocked the sale through legal maneuvering that Frick considered fraudulent. They settled after protracted litigation, but they never spoke again. According to legend, when Carnegie approached Frick in his final years seeking reconciliation, Frick replied, "Tell him I'll meet him in hell." The 7 workers who died on July 6, 1892, are buried in Homestead Cemetery. Their names are recorded in historical accounts: John Morris, Thomas Weldon, Silas Wayne, Peter Fairs, Joseph Sotak, Henry Striegel, George Rutter. They were sons and fathers and brothers, men with families and hopes and grievances that brought them to the riverbank that morning. They did not ask to die. They asked for fair wages and the right to bargain collectively for their labor. The company sent men to kill them. The song, "Father Was Killed by the Pinkerton Men," was well known across America at the end of the 19th century. Its lyrics began, "'Twas in a Pennsylvania town not very long ago, men struck against reduction of their pay. Their millionaire employer with philanthropic show had closed the works till starved they would obey." The song has faded from popular memory, but the conflict it commemorated shaped the relationship between American workers and American employers for a century. The steel that flowed from Homestead's furnaces was woven into the fabric of the nation. The armor plate that protected American warships in the Spanish-American War and 2 world wars came from those open-hearth furnaces. The structural beams that held up the Brooklyn Bridge and the Empire State Building were rolled in those mills. When historians speak of America's rise to industrial supremacy, they are speaking in large part about what happened at Homestead and places like it. But the human cost was also woven into that fabric, invisible but present. Every ton of steel produced represented hours of labor in conditions that would be considered intolerable today. The physical infrastructure of modern America was built on the labor of workers who had no choice but to accept the terms offered to them. From the hill overlooking the waterfront, you can see where the mill once stood. The parking lots and storefronts give no indication of the furnaces that once blazed there, the men who once labored there, the battle that once raged there. Only the smokestacks remain, 12 brick sentinels standing among the retail establishments. Shoppers pass them without looking up. Children play in their shadow without knowing what cast that shadow. The furnaces stand, the river flows, the town endures, and somewhere in the collective memory of America, the whistle still sounds at 5 in the morning, calling workers to the riverbank to meet the barges that carry armed men in the service of industrial power. The steel they made built America. The battle they fought shaped America. The questions they raised about power, about justice, about the value of human labor, and the limits of corporate authority remain as urgent now as they were when the first shots rang out across the water on July 6, 1892.